afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Report with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'll be delivering the Washington Report today. Let's get to it. The Senate returns today and will be in session until Thursday. The House will return tomorrow and stay in session through Friday. This week in the House, as I said, they'll return tomorrow with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House will begin the second session of the 119th Congress with a recorded vote on the quorum call. On Wednesday and for the balance of the week, the House will consider at least two bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 4593, the Shower Act, and H.R. 5184, the Affordable Homes Act. Other legislation may be considered, including H.Res. 780, providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1834 to advance policy priorities that will break the gridlock, which, believe it or not, is the legislative language that describes the Hakeem Jeffries discharge petition to force a vote on a 3-year extension of the Obamacare advanced premium tax credits that expired on December 31, about which we will speak more in a moment. Possibly also the veto message to accompany H.R. 131, the Finish the Arkansas Valley Conduit Act, and possibly the veto message to accompany H.R. 504, the Miccosukee Reserved Area Amendments Act. And just this morning, House and Senate appropriators released the text of a bipartisan, bicameral funding deal on 3 2026 appropriations bills: Commerce, Justice, Science, Interior, EPA, and Energy and Water. The House GOP leadership just teed that up for a vote on Thursday. This week in the Senate, as I said, the Senate will return this afternoon with first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the confirmation of Keith Bass to serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense. I also anticipate that the Democrats will succeed in forcing a vote on a war powers resolution to be offered by Virginia Democrat Tim Kaine. It won't pass, but it might be interesting to see how the votes break down. Now let's talk about a new twist on mail-in ballots. On Christmas Eve, the U.S. Postal Service announced a new policy. No longer would it guarantee that a piece of mail would be postmarked on the day it was dropped off at a post office or dropped in a mailbox. Now, says the Postal Service, a piece of mail will be postmarked the first time it is fed into an automated sorting machine, which usually happens at a regional mail facility, which is often many miles away from the post office where it was dropped off, and which could be several days after it is dropped off at a post office or left in a mailbox. A piece of mail can also be postmarked on the day it is dropped off at a post office if the sender asks a staff member that the mail be manually postmarked. The consequences for mail-in ballots could be enormous. The Washington Post explains, quote, "Most states require mail ballots to be in the hands of election officials by Election Day. 14 states provide a grace period, allowing mail ballots to be counted if they arrive after Election Day, if they are postmarked by Election Day, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. More than 24 others provide grace periods for military and overseas voters," end quote. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court announced in November it would decide whether state laws that allow states to count mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day are constitutional. A lawsuit brought by the Republican National Committee, the Mississippi Republican Party, the Libertarian Party of Mississippi, and a Mississippi voter challenged the state's mail-in ballot regime. Now let's talk some more about the Supreme Court, because President Trump, as we all know, did not spend 4 years in between terms just twiddling his thumbs. No, he and his allies were planning to push the boundaries of executive power, planning to test the limits of what the Supreme Court would allow. Consequently, his opponents sued his administration last year, a lot. Many of the policy changes he's made via executive order are working their way through the court system to the Supreme Court. As we prepare for the second year of President Trump's second term, Let's take just a few moments to review some of the cases that the Supreme Court will be ruling on between now and the end of its current term in June. First up, birthright citizenship. The name of the case is Trump v. Barbara. If the court rules in Trump's favor and allows the Trump administration to bar children of illegal immigrants born in the United States from being granted U.S. citizenship, it would overturn an understanding of the 14th Amendment that stood for more than a century. Second, Trump's tariffs. In April, President Trump imposed what he called reciprocal tariffs, using the powers granted to him under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. The name of the case is Learning Resources v. Trump. Opponents say the IEEPA doesn't even use the word tariff in the list of examples of things the president is authorized to do in an economic emergency. And they say his declaration that persistent trade deficits constitutes an international economic emergency that would trigger his ability to use the powers granted to him is absurd. If the court rules against him, his administration will have to refund more than $100 billion already collected. Third, in two cases, the Supreme Court will decide whether or not Title IX protects transgender athletes who want to compete in sports consistent with their so-called gender identity, rather than the gender they were assigned at birth. West Virginia v. BPJ is one of the cases, and the other is called Little v. Hecox. Fourth, the court will reconsider Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and how it has been interpreted for more than 40 years now. In a case called Louisiana v. Calais, the justices may decide to ban the practice of using race to create so-called majority-minority districts to allow minority voters to elect their candidates of choice. Fifth, the court is going to decide this term if the president has the authority to fire the leaders of so-called independent agencies of the executive branch. The cases are called Trump v. Cook and Trump v. Slaughter. But the name of the case you're going to hear most when people are talking about these particular cases is Humphrey's Executor, a case from 1934 in which the court created a precedent that says the president does not have the power to fire the heads of the independent agencies. Agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission. Now let's talk about government funding. Funding for the agencies and programs funded by the 9 appropriations bills encompassed in the December continuing resolution expires on January 30, which is 25 days from now. The chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and the chairwoman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, both Republicans, came to agreement on the top-line spending figures for the 9 remaining bills. They announced that right before everyone left town for Christmas. They say their Democrat counterparts, the ranking minority members of the 2 committees, have come to a general agreement on the spending top lines, but there's no formal deal in place yet. Reading between the lines, that means the spending levels are likely to be much closer to the Senate committee's numbers than to the House committee's numbers, because House Republicans' numbers are always lower than Senate Republican numbers. That's at least partly a function of the different protocols and vibes in the Senate, where the 60-vote threshold requires compromise up front. Senate Majority Leader John Thune wanted very much to move a 5-bill minibus through the Senate in December before they went home for the holiday, but his efforts were stymied by the 2 Democrat senators from Colorado, who used their holds to block a unanimous consent request. The 2 were angered by the Trump administration's decision to nix funding for the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. The 5 bills Thune wanted to include in one package were the Labor HHS Education Bill, the Defense Department Spending Bill, the Transportation HUD Spending Bill, the Interior EPA Spending Bill, and Commerce Justice Science Spending Bill. Combined with the 3 appropriations bills that were passed last year, That is the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Bill, the Department of Agriculture Bill, and the Legislative Branch Appropriations Bill. The 5 bills here, if passed, would provide funding for 85 to 90% of the federal government, thereby eliminating the threat of a government shutdown at the end of January. But, as I mentioned earlier, this morning, the chairman of the 2 chambers' appropriations committees released the text of a 3-bill minibus that includes Commerce, Justice, Science, Interior, EPA, and Energy and Water. That will likely move through the House first, later this week, and then through the Senate. That will leave 6 of the 12 bills that fund the government still needing resolution before funding expires on January 30. Now to health care. December 31 came and went, and took with it the Obamacare advanced premium tax credits, that is, the government's subsidies that the Biden administration created back in 2021. As a consequence of that deliberate act by Democrats, healthcare premiums will increase for roughly 22 million Americans. And while Democrats planned for exactly this to happen when in 2022, when they still controlled the Senate, the House, and the White House, and could do and did do everything they wanted without a single Republican vote, it will, nevertheless, be the Republicans who get the blame. Why? For several reasons. First, there's the dominant media, which is composed largely of grizzled reporters who tend to be left-wing veterans ideologically committed to the imposition of big government solutions to everything, and young reporters who haven't been around to cover enough yet and are similarly ideologically predisposed to support the imposition of big government solutions to everything. Second, there's the Democrats on Capitol Hill who will continue to scream at the top of their lungs that this is all the Republicans' fault. Third, there's the public, which has been conditioned over the decades to believe that Democrats are better for health care than Republicans, whatever that means. The House will vote this week on a measure to extend the expired subsidies for 3 years. And given that the House is going to vote on the measure because 4 Republicans crossed party lines to sign a discharge petition offered by Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, I expect it'll pass. In that form, it will not pass the Senate, though. We know that because the Senate took a procedural vote 3 weeks ago to extend the expiring subsidies for 3 years. The procedural vote was actually a vote to end debate on a motion to consider the bill, and it fell 9 votes short of the 60 votes needed. But supporters of extending the subsidies think passage in the House will lead to negotiations in the Senate. In their view, the Senate could fashion a bipartisan compromise that extends the subsidies for a year or 2 while lowering the income threshold to ensure that families making $600,000 annually don't receive the subsidies as they did before they expired, and adding some anti-fraud measures because we had some indications that as many as 12 million accounts may have been fraudulently created. To that end, freshman Republican Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio, veteran Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine, and retiring Democrat Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire have convened a bipartisan group of 9 senators to work on the issue. They had a Zoom meeting during the holiday break and will meet this week in person. Moreno and Collins have a proposal to extend the subsidies for 2 years, combined with income caps and anti-fraud measures like we just talked about, and Majority Leader John Thune will soon have to decide what to do with it. That will likely be a function of how much, if any, additional support the measure receives in his conference. There's also a question of whether or not a bipartisan package could win any more Democrat support. Many Democrats, apparently including Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, think the Republicans had many chances last year to vote to extend the subsidies and they passed. So why give them a chance to fix their own mistake this year? After all, he wants a new first name. He wants to be Majority Leader Schumer again, and he thinks the GOP has done itself significant political damage by failing to extend the subsidies. The White House, too, seems to think it would be the best for the GOP if the subsidies could be extended, with some program reforms, income caps, and anti-fraud measures. Assume all that happens and a bipartisan package passes the Senate. Then it would go back to the House and it would land like a thud on Speaker Johnson's doorstep. Near as I can tell, there are 3 basic factions inside the House GOP conference on this question. The first group thinks they'll never win a fight over health care with the Democrats. So the less said about health care, the better. This group composes the majority of the House GOP conference. Call them the Move On Caucus. The second group thinks it's absurd that the GOP doesn't have a better plan for health care than the Democrats, and thinks that the GOP should push for a major health care overhaul. Chip Roy of Texas, the policy chair of the House Freedom Caucus, is one of these congressmen. He's been fighting Obamacare since he was Senator Ted Cruz's chief of staff, long before he was a congressman. The third group is composed of so-called moderate Republicans who think the GOP committed electoral hara-kiri by allowing the subsidies to expire in the first place. Think Mike Lawler and the 3 Pennsylvania Republicans who joined him in signing on to Jeffrey's discharge petition. Speaker Johnson said before the holiday break that he wanted to spend much of 2026 dealing with health care. That puts him at odds with the vast majority of the House GOP conference, which would far prefer to spend much of 2026 dealing with anything other than health care. Stay tuned. Now for the latest on Ukraine and Russia. As the U.S., Ukraine, Russia, the European Union and NATO and others jockey for position and influence in the ongoing discussions over the possibility of a ceasefire and a potential end to Russia's war on Ukraine, the relative fortunes of Ukraine have bobbed up and down like a cork at sea, varying in direct proportion to how close was President Trump's last phone call with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. The closer to that phone call, the worse things were for Ukraine. Case in point, last Monday, after Trump spent much of Sunday with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at Mar-a-Lago, Trump got on a phone call with Putin, who told Trump that his own personal residence had been targeted for a drone strike by Ukraine. Trump accepted Putin's assertion at face value and later that day told reporters that he was, quote, very angry, unquote, about Ukraine's attack. Except there appears to be no evidence the attack on Putin's personal residence ever happened. By Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal was reporting that the CIA had briefed Trump on the matter and had told him they did not believe Putin's story. On Saturday, during Trump's press conference regarding the Venezuela operation, about which we will speak more in just a moment, Trump was asked about Putin, and he said he was, quote, not very thrilled, unquote, with Putin right now. Then, last night, gaggling with reporters on Air Force One as he returned from Florida to the White House, President Trump said the U.S. government does not believe the attack happened. Quote, I don't believe the strike happened, he said. We don't believe that happened now that we've been able to check, unquote. Now to Venezuela. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday night, President Trump gave the order to launch a mission codenamed Absolute Resolve, an extraction operation in which 150 aircraft would launch from 20 different locations to rendezvous in the skies over the Caribbean to blind, degrade, and eliminate air defense systems meant to protect Nicolas Maduro and his regime in Venezuela. A little more than 2 hours later, under cover of a darkness caused not by nightfall, but by an induced blackout of the capital city's power grid, a team of Delta Force warriors entered the presidential palace, where, according to personal intelligence gathered by an asset of the Central Intelligence Agency close enough to Maduro to know his sleeping habits, the nation's leader and his wife could be found and captured before they were able to enter and secure themselves in a safe room prepared for just such exigencies. Within 90 minutes, Maduro and his wife were in custody and aboard U.S. aircraft on their way out of Venezuela. They were set to be arraigned Monday afternoon in New York City on charges that Maduro facilitated the transport of thousands of tons of cocaine to the United States. Not a single American airman, soldier, sailor, Marine, or Coast Guardsman was lost. Not a single American warplane was lost. Not a single American warship was lost. At a press conference Saturday morning, about 12 hours after he had given the go signal on the operation, President Trump declared that the United States would, in his words, quote, run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition, unquote, to a new leadership. Quote, we can't take a chance that somebody else takes over Venezuela that doesn't have the good of the Venezuelan people in mind, he said. His initial choice appears to be a woman named Delcy Rodriguez, who until Friday night was the nation's vice president under Maduro. Her brother is the head of the national parliament. Their father was a fabled communist guerrilla who famously kidnapped and held hostage for 3 years an American corporate executive in Venezuela in the 1970s. When she was 7 years old, she was allowed to visit her father in his jail cell, and she recalls being pushed into the cell with him so the guards could close the cell door behind her after tossing into the cell a tear gas canister. She grew up to become a committed Marxist ideologue herself. President Trump said during his Saturday morning press conference that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had spoken with Rodriguez earlier and she had agreed to do whatever the U.S. wanted. Hours later, she said publicly that the U.S. should not have done what it had done and that Maduro should be returned to Venezuela immediately. By Sunday, after not-so-subtle warnings from the White House, she had shifted her tone at least somewhat and seemed to be measuring her words more carefully, with a view, if not to currying favor with Trump, at least not to causing anger inside the Oval Office. Late Monday afternoon, key congressional leaders will be briefed by senior administration officials, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, the minority leaders of both houses, and the chairman and ranking minority members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, Armed Services Committees, and the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations Committees will all be in attendance. To Trump critics who say this is unprecedented and illegal, I say balderdash and poppycock. This is, in fact, almost the exact same set of circumstances that obtained in December of 1989, when that reckless cowboy president, George Herbert Walker Bush of silk-stockinged Connecticut, ordered a U.S. military incursion codenamed Just Cause, an extraction mission into Panama to seize its narco-terrorist dictator, Manuel Noriega. The only difference is that Noriega was able to flee to the Vatican's diplomatic mission and take cover there for more than a week. U.S. armed forces surrounded the compound and had to play psyops against him, blasting heavy metal rock on boom boxes all through the night to keep him from sleeping. Finally, on January 3rd, 1990, exactly 36 years to the day before Operation Absolute Resolve seized the Maduros, the Panamanian dictator surrendered to U.S. armed forces and was moved to the United States, where he stood trial for his crimes and was found guilty of 8 separate offenses, including drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. He served 17 years in the United States in prison before he was extradited to France. One other note about the Panama parallel that we certainly hope is not similar. In Panama in 1989, the Pentagon deployed an occupying force of 27,000 soldiers. Venezuela is 12 times the size of Panama, and it has a population that's 6.5 times as big. So let's hope we don't need to deploy an occupying force in Venezuela, because it'll be a lot bigger than a lot of people might like. One final note regarding Operation Absolute Resolve. I said the operation was pulled off without the loss of a single American life. That's true. That is not to say, though, that it was entirely bloodless. According to the Cuban government over the weekend, 32 Cuban soldiers and Interior Ministry personnel tasked to provide security for Nicolas Maduro were killed by U.S. armed forces in the operation. And it says something interesting about a dictator, that he felt he couldn't even trust his own countrymen to protect him, and he needed instead to import security forces from another country to do the job. That's our Washington Report for this week. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop us a line at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question during the broadcast, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Washington Report. Same time, same channel. Until then, be well and be active.